Is our focus this evening. I just want to begin by reading verses 1 and 2, and then I'll have you look down to verse number 9 for one particular phrase that's repeated through the chapter. Leviticus 1:1 says, "The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you bring an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock.'" Now look at the verse number 9. This phrase is repeated in verse 12 and in verse 17. And here's what it says. "The priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, which will be a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord." That's the phrase of emphasis tonight as we think about chapter 1. A pleasing aroma to the Lord. So last week we began Leviticus with an introduction to the book, a summary of where we are going in this study together, what its purpose is in the context of redemptive history. Of course, its purpose in the story of God saving sinners. Leviticus is a book often avoided. We talked about that a little bit last Wednesday, and the reason why it's often avoided is because of the litany of laws and the complexity it contains regarding the Old Testament sacrificial system. Yet, as we've already emphasized, it's hard to grasp the full depth of the gospel without an understanding of Leviticus. This book, the book of Leviticus, it answers the question, how can an unholy people dwell in the midst of a holy God? Remember, this is how the book of Exodus ended. Moses and the Israelites built the tabernacle in the book of Exodus precisely as God instructed, and God filled the tabernacle with His presence. But the problem, however, is that the people could not come near the presence of God. Not even their great spiritual leader, Moses, could come near it. Again, you're there in Leviticus 1. We did this last week. We got to do it one more time. Flip over real quickly. Hold your finger in Leviticus 1. Flip over real quickly to Exodus chapter 40 and look at verse 34. Exodus 40:34, it says, "The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." That is, the presence of God came and dwelt in the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter that tabernacle. He could not go into the tent of meeting because the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So finally, this tabernacle is built and God's promised presence comes and dwells inside of it. However, we can't go in. We can't even go near. That's the problem. Well, Leviticus is the answer to this problem. And that's why the book opens up here in verse 1 of chapter 1 with the Lord speaking to Moses from the tabernacle. And he begins by telling Moses what they as a people must do in order to dwell with and enjoy the presence of God. That instruction that he gives here is fixed in the sacrificial offerings of worship. There are 5 offerings of sacrificial worship. We touched on these briefly last Wednesday. I want to remind you of them again. This is what the first 7 chapters of Leviticus is all about. Leviticus 1 through 7, it's about these 5 offerings. We have the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. Just so you know where we're going, chapter 1 is the burnt offering, chapter 2 is the grain offering, chapter 3 is the peace offering, chapter 4 and 5 is the sin offering, and chapter 6 and 7 is the trespass offering. They are classified as such according to their motivation, as well as their necessity. The most common, which is the first one mentioned here in Leviticus 1, was the burnt offering. The burnt offering was an expression of complete and total commitment to God. It was a personal offering, something that an individual would acknowledge in sacrifice of God's lordship over the worshiper's life. Through this burnt offering, the worshiper, even in symbolism, was completely surrendering his best to God in a sacrificial and obedient act of devotion. Of course, that's what God requires. He requires our best in sacrifice to Him. He requires complete and total surrender. And so what we have here in Leviticus chapter 1 is an underlining of the burnt offering. And it's given to us in 3 sets of instruction, each separated by the paragraphs. If you have a Bible that is put together in the form of paragraphs, you're going to find 3 paragraphs in Leviticus chapter 1. And so each paragraph divides for us each set of instructions as it relates to the burnt offering. So let's kind of walk through these together. And then we'll conclude our time by applying what all this means to us today. Well, in verses 3 through 9, which is the first paragraph, is the first set of instructions, and that was given to those who would bring an offering from the herds. Okay, this was a sacrifice of bulls. He says in verse 3 that it had to be a male without blemish. So again, this is not just any bull. It had to be the very best of the herd, a male without blemish. That means it's not only the best of the herd, it's the most costly from the herd. It's a valuable sacrifice. So not just any bull, but the very best, the most costly had to be brought. Verse 3 says they were to bring it to the entrance of the tabernacle. Once they get there, they would lay their hand on the head of the sacrifice. That's what verse 4 tells us. Now, why would they lay their hands on the head of the bull, the sacrifice? Well, that was symbolic. It indicated a person's identification with that particular animal, in this case, the bull. And it effectively signaled the substitution of that sacrifice in the place of the worshiper. So as he takes his hand and puts it on the head of the bull, he is symbolically saying, God, I am giving this sacrifice to you in my place. In some cases, as we learn in other portions of Scripture, a prayer would be prayed as they laid their hand on the head of that sacrifice. Or a singing of a psalm would be offered here. Many scholars believe through different records of Scripture and historical settings that Psalm 20 was one of those psalms that would be sung or prayed in this moment of ritual as the people would lay their hand upon the head of that sacrifice. Once that was completed, the bull would then be killed, verse 5 tells us. It would be sacrificed. Now, that was most likely done through the slitting of the bull's throat, which he then would be laid upon the table, allowing the blood to drain. The purpose of that is because the priests were required to take the blood of that animal and then throw it against the sides of the altar, which was located in the tabernacle. Now, this is an important thing to note here because it's not the worshiper who's handling the blood. It's the priest's job to handle the blood. And we see the handling of sacrificial blood to be a big part of the storyline of Leviticus. Why so? Well, because the blood was the life of the animal, which was the holiest part. So the priest, considered among the people by God to be the holiest among them, were the only ones who could handle the blood. And so they would take the blood of the sacrifice, again in this case the bull, which meant the life of that animal was being offered to God. Throwing the blood up against the altar is saying we are giving the life of this sacrifice to God. Verse 6 says that the worshiper would then skin the sacrifice, and cut it into pieces. Some of you say, this all sounds familiar. I've already killed a couple deer. I've done this already this year. It's not quite the same, but I think you get the imagery at least. They skin the sacrifice. They cut it into pieces. And then the priest, in verses 6 through 9, would arrange the pieces of the animal sacrifice on the altar and proceed to burn all of it. Hence, the burnt offering. They would burn the whole animal, minus the skin, all right? The priest would keep the skin, but all the meat of the animal was completely burned up. In this particular sacrifice, unlike some other sacrifices, no food was left over for anyone. It was just completely burned up. That was the first set of instructions. You come to the second paragraph, you see the second set of instructions. It involved sacrifices which were brought from among the flocks. We see that in verse 10. So the first set of instructions are those who would bring a bull, and the second instructions are among those who would bring a sheep or a goat. Now, without going through all of it, the instructions for the sheep were relatively the same as those for the bulls. They were to choose among their flocks a male without blemish, bring it to the tabernacle, kill it, again throw the blood against the altar, cut it into pieces, burn it all up completely as a pleasing sacrifice to God, keeping none of it for themselves. And then you get to this third set of instructions. That comes in verse 14 and carries it down through the rest of the chapter, verse 17. The third set of instructions pertain to those who chose to bring a bird for a burnt offering. So this is those who did not bring a sheep or a goat or a bull, but for those who brought a bird. Now, some of you may already be wondering, why do we have three different instructions, three different animals of choice? Why is this the case? Well, the best and most costly for the wealthiest of Israel would not have been the birds, it would have been the bulls. Now, that was a small number of the citizenship of Israel, but there were very wealthy people at this time, and those were the ones who had herds. So what was best for them, what was most costly for them, was to bring not a bird, not a sheep, but a bull. But then there was another class of people who only had access to a sheep or a goat. The third set of instructions identify that there were many who were very poor, making birds the only thing that they could afford. It was truly sacrificial because it was all that they had access to. It was all they could afford. You may even remember, it's hard to believe we're getting close to Christmas. I know some of you have already put your decorations up, but can we not at least have turkey first? It's coming. And perhaps in our Christmas series of sermons, we might touch on this at some point. I don't know. But the whole imagery of two turtle doves has to do with the fact that you'll know after Mary gave birth to Jesus, her and Joseph proceeded to the temple for ceremonial cleansing. And a part of ceremonial cleansing after giving birth to a child was you had to offer a burnt offering, a burnt sacrifice back to the Lord. And what was it that Mary and Joseph offered? Well, it wasn't sheep and it wasn't bulls. It was actually a pair of turtle doves, two birds, indicating that Jesus was born into a poor family. So the principle that you have here is that we are to bring what is best. We are to bring and sacrifice to God what is most costly. That was the message to Israel. Don't bring birds if you have sheep. And don't bring sheep if you have bulls. Now, to be sure, the temptation may have been at times to offer something other than the best, something other than a sheep without blemish. After all, to sacrifice the best is to sacrifice something that indeed is valuable, something that cost you. I mean, think about it in our congregation. What if I said that the Lord told me that next Sunday you are to donate one of your cars to the church? And you go home and you think, well, we've had this one the longest and it's barely kicking. I mean, I don't even know if I could get $500 out of it. Let's give that one to the church. Kathleen and I are often reminiscing about when I first came here 18 years ago, that I would pull up to the office on any random day and I would find broken microwaves and refrigerators and other things laying out at the front door with a note on it that said, we got a new one, this one doesn't work anymore. We thought the church would like it. Why would you think we'd want it? Okay, it's a similar idea here. If you are a rich person with a lot of bulls, go give the best one without blemish to God. Don't find one that's got a broken leg and is cross-eyed. Give what is best. Give what is costly. However, the instructions are pretty clear. You bring what you can afford, right? Of course, with the birds, there was a slight adjustment to the procedure. For instance, there's no command that the bird be without blemish. I find that interesting. The bull had to be without blemish. The sheep had to be without blemish, but the bird didn't have to be without blemish. Why do you think that's the case? Now, conjecture on my part, but I think it's just due to the fact that this was the offering of the poor. So in God's grace, he's saying, give what you can give, even if that bird has a little blemish. But the process remained the same with the bird. You kill it, you drain the blood, you burn it as an offering upon the altar. Now, why would they do these offerings? What were the occasions of them? Why carry out this sacrifice of a burnt offering? And when was it expected to be offered? Well, we're going to see in other locations that there were three main occasions in which a burnt offering was called for by the Lord. Here's the first occasion, the occasion of morning and evening sacrifices. I don't have time to take you there, but write down Numbers chapter 28. You can also revisit it when we go forward into Leviticus chapter 6. You're going to find in Numbers 28 and Leviticus chapter 6 that on the occasion of morning praises to God and evening praises to God, that people would bring these sacrifices in general worship to the Lord. In fact, the priests were required to keep the fire of the burnt offerings going at all times. They were not allowed to ever let the fire go out. So the smoke of the burnt offering would be constantly, 24 hours a day, ascending from the place of the tabernacle up to the heavens. So every morning, every evening, individuals and families would be bringing sacrifices of burnt offerings to the Lord. They were also called for on special days in the life of Israel. You can read about these in Numbers chapter 28 and 29. I'm talking about the special ceremonial days like the Sabbath, the festivals, priestly ordination, any special day that you would have. So let's say it's the morning of a special day. Well, in the morning, you would have sacrifices that you would bring because it's just an average day and it's in the morning. It's also a special day, so you're going to bring an extra sacrifice. But then there was a third occasion. The third occasion is what we call ritual uncleanness. We read about this in Leviticus chapter 12 through Leviticus chapter 15. What are we talking about when we talk about ritual uncleanness? In other words, the holiness of God demanded that the people of Israel constantly present themselves through sacrifice as clean before the Lord. So, after childbirth, they would have to offer a sacrifice. They would offer a sacrifice in the case of a leper who was pronounced clean. Male or female bodily discharge would require at any point that occurred a sacrifice to be offered back to the Lord. So think about this. In a nation of millions, burnt offerings are happening all the time, meaning that the tabernacle on this one offering alone, and this is only the first of how many? 5. We got 4 more to go. On this one offering alone, the tabernacle was a very busy place. as the people were constantly acknowledging their sinful nature and unholiness before God. I believe that's the purpose for the fire of the burnt offering being continual, with the smoke constantly ascending. It was to serve as a reminder in the camp of Israel that they were by nature and by practice an unholy and sinful people. So there might be a particular day in a setting of uncleanness that you might be bringing 14 bulls, 2 sheep, and 3 birds. That's a lot of sacrifices for millions of people. I think this is a good place to apply these lessons because my time's almost up. What are the lessons from the burnt offering, which again was required for unholy people to dwell in the midst of a holy God? I wrote down 3 general principles, purposes that I think we can take away as lessons from this. First one, God is holy, and without His provision, we are not. God is holy, and without His provision, we are not. Think about this. Leviticus doesn't make sense. The Bible doesn't make sense. The gospel doesn't make sense unless you see it all through the certainty of God's perfect holiness. You have to view the sacrifices through the holiness of God. You have to view the offerings through the holiness of God. You have to view all of these laws through the holiness of God. I would go as far as to say tonight, church, that understanding life itself, both personally and in all that exists, it begins at the point of God's perfect holiness and man's utter sinfulness. If we don't understand God's perfect holiness and man's utter sinfulness, we won't understand anything about life, the Bible, and the gospel. If for any reason at all, that continual smoke of the burnt offering, the daily approaching the tabernacle of the sacrifices, bird after bird, goat after goat, bull after bull, it was to remind them as a people, you are unholy, and God is holy. The burnt offering, day after day, night after night, festival after festival, was a reminder that we are sinful people living in the midst of a holy God. And were it not for God's provision of these sacrifices, we would all die. That's the first lesson. God is holy, and without His provision of sacrifice, we are not. Second lesson is this. Sacrifice is the way to experience and enjoy God's presence. Sacrifice is the way to experience and enjoy God's presence. Would you listen carefully to it? Sacrifice is the deepest of all expressions. Sacrifice is the deepest of all expressions. It is the extent to which we assign value to something, offering the best one can possibly give to show love and commitment to another. That's why in this room we have parents who regularly sacrifice for their children. It's the deepest expression they can offer them. It's the extent to which they assign value to their children, offering the best they possibly can give to show their love and commitment to that child. So parents sacrifice for their children. This is why, as we celebrated yesterday on Veterans Day, why soldiers are willing to sacrifice for the ideas and freedoms of a country. Because sacrifice is the deepest of all expressions. That's why a marriage will never experience love's most intimate expressions until each spouse learns to love the other with the greatest of sacrifices. And it's only by sacrifice. the deepest of all expressions, that God permits unholy people to come in and experience and enjoy Him. And because of God's holiness, only the best and most valuable sacrifice will do. Which leads me to the third lesson. Here it is. Number 3. Only the proper sacrifice is pleasing to God. Only the proper sacrifice is pleasing to God. I want you to remember this. Worship that costs nothing means nothing. Worship that costs nothing means nothing. Worship that is cheap leads to a cheap experience with God. Worship that is superficial, that is diminished, it all leads to a superficial and diminished experience with God. Consider it in relation to our text. He required a sacrifice without blemish. If you own bulls, you gave the best of your herd. If only sheep, the best of your flock. If you had next to nothing, you gave the best that you could, a bird. Again, I drive this home. A worshiper was not permitted to offer God something cheap, left over, or of little value to the worshiper. He had to give the best. It had to be the most costly gift that could be personally offered. A true sacrifice. The only proper sacrifice that is pleasing to God is not giving what we don't have, but giving the best and most valuable of what we do have. You cannot escape this fundamental essential of true worship. Are you sacrificing your best? Are you giving to God what is most valuable? Or are you keeping that for yourself? He says here in verse 9 and verse 12 and verse 17 that when that sacrifice is offered properly, as God instructed, it will be an offering that is a pleasing aroma to the Lord. It'll please the Lord. Not to give sheep if you own bulls. No, that doesn't please the Lord. It only pleases the Lord to give bulls when you own bulls. Now I'm done, but listen carefully how this relates to redemption. Over and over again, the worshiper would come to the temple, to the tabernacle, acknowledging that they were a sinner. And out of devotion to God's lordship, they would put their hand on that animal sacrifice, the best, the most costly they had to offer. And they would make that offering as a substitute for themselves, which showed that they were committing their lives to a holy God. And they would do this week after week, month after month, day after day, year after year, century after century. The continual offering of animals, the continual shedding of blood, the continual burning of flesh upon the altar, the continual rising of smoke day after day, year after year, offering after offering. All of this they did for centuries. For centuries. And then one day, a bug-eating prophet dressed in camel's hair shows up. And he points to a man walking down the banks of the river, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, the sacrifice, who takes away the sin of the world." The Lamb, the man Jesus Christ is the very best and most costly sacrifice that the God of heaven could offer. And in one once and for all sacrifice, the best and most costly sacrifice God gave. He gave it for the sins of his people, the full and complete sacrifice of himself. That's why you should tune out any song that tells you God went searching through heaven to find one who was willing to go. No, it was never about that. It was always about God giving the best that he had, that which was most costly to him. And what is that? That's himself. That's himself. And when Jesus died on the cross as that burnt offering, yes, that burnt offering for your sin and my sin, the smoke ascended to heaven as a pleasing aroma to God. That's the gospel. Jesus Christ came, and as a lamb without spot or blemish, he died, was buried, he rose again, and he did this as a substitute for sinners. So as worshipers, we may not can reach out our hands and touch the head of Jesus, but we certainly lift our hands toward Jesus, acknowledging him as our substitutionary sacrifice, who by offering himself has allowed us to enter into and enjoy the presence of God. I don't know if that gives you chill bumps, but it certainly is me. And so that's why we also offer ourselves as a sacrifice to God. What Paul said in Romans chapter 12. You be a living sacrifice to God. Because it is our lives presented to God as a living sacrifice that is in and of itself a pleasing act of worship to the Lord. For there is no legitimate claim of commitment or devotion to God on your part if there is no costly sacrifice to him. There is no legitimate claim of commitment or devotion to God on your part if there is no costly sacrifice to him. This is what God requires. This is what he gave. And this in return is what we give back to him. Thanks be to God that Jesus is the full and pleasing aroma in the nostrils of God in our place. Let's stand together. Father, bless